there, epidemics. I see that you guys are already feeling the semester, even though we're still early in the semester. I see we've got people going 3, 4, 8, 9, all the tired looking cats. All right, well, let's see if we can get some excitement into this class. We're talking today about some general information about infectious diseases. So there's a review quiz this week, which covers material from the first lecture through the end of this week. So this lecture and Thursday's lecture. And the journal prompt has already been posted on Blackboard, and it refers to some material that we're going to cover on Thursday. When we last met, we explained the difference between R naught and R effective. Remember that R naught is a hypothetical value and is used to compare rates of transmission between different diseases. R effective describes the rate of disease spread in real world situations. And so the R effective can be different in different populations for the same disease. So if we look at the R effective for COVID, when it was new back in 2020, it had a higher spread than it does nowadays. When we went through the Omicron surge, that was a nasty surge. We also saw a higher R effective than at the times between these surges. Right now, numbers are pretty low, and the R effective is pretty low. We also covered our terminology about spillover, outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. Spillover is when a zoonotic disease, did I define that one last time for you guys? Zoonotic refers to a disease that can be spread between humans and some other type of animal. So a spillover is when a zoonotic disease crosses into humans. An outbreak is a small number of cases in a small area. Outbreak is the ideal time to contain a potentially new disease. It works better once we understand the disease, and it works better for things like Ebola, where those don't tend to be able to spread very easily. So that's, we often get outbreaks of Ebola that we then use public health measures to contain. Epidemics, there's more cases, slightly more widespread. Pandemics, widespread. There's not a specific number of cases or number of locations to separate epidemics and pandemics. Endemic is a term that is used where you've got transmission, it's in the population, and the number of cases remains relatively constant. So we're not seeing huge increases in cases. We're not seeing widespread cases. Okay, so that's where we ended up last time. We're going to start now talking about how diseases are transmitted. The first one we're going to talk about are airborne diseases. These spread through the air. They can spread through respiratory droplets. They can have virus or bacteria, usually virus, suspended in the air that goes from one person to another. These are largely respiratory, but there are some examples of digestive diseases, specifically a group of diseases called rotavirus. Rotavirus is a very common digestive disorder. It is extremely common on cruise ships. And it can spread through a cruise ship like you wouldn't believe. So if we look at this image from the CDC, the top image, there's not very good ventilation. Yeah, this is pretty much most of the classrooms at North Shore. The door's shut, the window's shut, so there's no fresh air coming in. And these droplets can stay suspended in the air for longer periods of time, and they can travel further distances. When we improve ventilation, and especially when we open windows, those droplets get removed from the air much quicker. They spread out the window. We've got air movement taking these droplets away, either into the ventilation system or out the window, and the disease is not going to spread as well. If we improve ventilation in buildings across the board, COVID numbers would definitely go down. But it's expensive. The next method of transportation is by arthropod or vector. So a vector is an animal that can carry a disease from one individual to another individual. They can do this in several different ways. If we think about mechanical transmission, this is where a vector lands on something that's contaminated and then lands on either your skin or on your food. Flies are the most common arthropod vector. Arthropod is the term that describes insects and spiders and lobsters and a few other things. So mechanical, a fly lands on dog feces in your backyard and then lands on the potato salad that you're serving for your picnic. And then you eat it and then you get the disease. We can also see bite associated. And this is the one we most often think about. And we think about this mostly with mosquitoes. So mosquitoes can bite somebody, they take up a blood meal. Any disease that's in their blood is now in the digestive tract of the mosquito. A lot of diseases can survive this. Things like malaria can survive in the mosquito, infects the mosquito, so it does cause a disease in the mosquito, and then moves to the salivary glands, where when the mosquito bites somebody else, the malaria parasite goes out with the saliva gets injected into you to reduce blood clotting and pain, so you don't feel the sensation of being bitten. Mosquitoes are often considered the deadliest animal on Earth. And it's due to their ability to spread diseases, especially malaria. Malaria is often believed to be the deadliest infectious disease in the history of mankind, which is why we'll be talking about it later in the semester. We can also think about vector spread through ticks and fleas. So these can spread things like Lyme disease and plague. We're not going to talk about Lyme. We are going to talk about plague. Plague is the disease that caused the Black Death, which is far and away the deadliest pandemic in written history. The next method of spread I want to talk about is something called fecal oral. So in general, this does not mean that people are eating feces. Your dog might eat feces and can contract diseases that way, but generally what happens is we get food contaminated by feces. And this food can be contaminated at any step in the process. Certain microorganisms in the soil can be picked up by crops, and they can get into the leaves of lettuce, and then somebody eats the lettuce and takes up that microorganism, usually a bacteria. The thing is, since it's inside the leaves, no amount of washing is going to get that contamination off. And that can come from situations like this, where cows get into the fields. They're not supposed to be there. It can happen when deer get into the field. It can happen when there are cows or pigs uphill from a farm. They poop there, the water runs down the hill, carrying the bacteria with them. We also have situations where farm workers are not given adequate facilities. They're working in the field, and they either go uphill to take care of their business, or, find somewhere to do it. And that can contaminate things. We can get cross-contamination. This happens during processing and packing, and it usually occurs when workers are sick. People who work in the food industry, from farms through packaging and processing and all of that kind of stuff, they're not well paid. They're going to come into work when they're sick. They can't afford to take time off. This is going to be the biggest source of problems with cross-contamination is with chopped lettuce or pre-cut fruits. So if you buy pre-cut fruits or salad mix, that's the most likely place where we're going to see this cross-contamination. And food preparation can also be a problem. Again, people who work in the food industry, preparing food, cooking food, serving food, desperately underpaid, not likely to take time off. They'll come in when they're sick. And this is the biggest way that hepatitis A gets spread. Somebody comes in, is working there, they can, if they have hepatitis A, they can spread it through the food, even if they're taking safety precautions. We really hope that our food preparation people wash their hands after using the bathroom, because otherwise, there we go. You guys following along okay? Everyone? Yeah. Okay,
yes.
Thanks. Another way diseases can be transmitted through food. Oops. Shellfish can take up contaminations from water. This is well known when we talk about red tide. So red tide is a situation where single-celled phytoplankton, algae has a sudden increase in their population, usually due to situations like runoff from the land, runoff of fertilizer from people's lawns, from farms, or flooding, where we get our sewage systems aren't able to handle it and we get sewage washed into the water. That can be taken up by shellfish. So lobster, okay, lobster's not a shellfish, sorry. Oysters, clams, mussels. Red tide is one of the reasons governments limit where and when you can harvest shellfish. Do not harvest shellfish when the government's telling you you can't do it now or you can't do it in this area. There's very often a reason for that. And it can be a contagious organism. It can also be non-contagious situations where there are toxins in the water. So the shellfish will also take up toxins. We also see this as a problem in the food chain in the marine situation, in saltwater areas, where your bivalves take up the phytoplankton and bacteria, but then those get eaten by fish, or fish eat the phytoplankton. That gets passed into things like pelicans, that can get into crustaceans, crabs, and lobsters. All of these animals can get waterborne toxins into their bloodstream, which, if you eat them, can then get into you. And we're seeing this more and more commonly being a problem. Out here in California, where I live, I don't like to eat the locally caught seafood because the water is so contaminated with DDT, which is it used to be a pesticide, but we banned it permanently. And the companies that were making it had plenty of DDT on site. They couldn't sell it. So what did they do? They dumped it in the ocean. And it's showing up in huge concentrations in the tissues of local marine fish. We can also get foodborne diseases in the flesh, the meat of animals. So these are largely cows, pigs, goats, or wild game like deer and elk. It's not as common to catch a disease from the meat of birds. We are less related to birds, so it's harder for diseases to spread between birds and humans. Not impossible, though. And the example I've got here is trichinosis. So trichinosis is a parasite. This is a stained microscope slide, and this is the trichinella parasite in what we call a cyst. Parasites often form these structures. They've got a wall around the body of the parasite, and that cyst is designed to separate the parasite from the organism who's infected. And this can either be produced by the immune system of the host or by the parasite itself. So trichinosis is specifically found in pork, And it can be destroyed with high temperatures. So undercooked pork can transmit this particular disease. This is why you should not eat raw or rare pork products. Medium rare, that's okay. That gets warm enough to get rid of the trichinosis. You should also not eat raw or rare chicken. With chickens, it's largely salmonella. It can get into their tissues, and chickens are highly susceptible to salmonella, and it's very, very common in large production facilities where you get a lot of chickens being raised. But again, cooking helps with these types of diseases. It doesn't help with everything. So there's a disease called mad cow disease. And it's largely been eliminated from the food chain, especially in the US. We haven't found it in meat products for decades, I'm pretty sure. But mad cow disease, there are no treatments for this. And cooking does not protect against mad cow disease. There is a disease related to mad cow called chronic wasting. And this is seen in deer and elk in certain parts of the country. Chronic wasting disease, we do not know if it can spread to people, but this is why if chronic wasting disease is in an area, it is not recommended to hunt deer and elk in those areas. Risk of contagious diseases is why America requires dairy products to be pasteurized. There's this idea among certain people that raw milk is better for you, straight from the cow, unpasteurized. Raw milk will help your immune system. Oh, but it can often cause diseases in people. So we're seeing an increase in milk-borne diseases because some people are buying unpasteurized milk and consuming it. You've probably heard of eggs and salmonella. Yep. Nope. Usually eggs do not transmit salmonella. Usually it is transmitted in flour. So even if you're a vegan, if you consume products with flour in it, there's a risk. Fortunately, if you cook the flour, you get rid of the salmonella and the risk is zero. But it's the flour that is why you should not eat raw cookie dough. Now, I'm, kind of middle-aged. I've got a perfectly healthy immune system. I'm sorry, raw cookie dough is one of the best things in the world to eat. And I take that risk. If I had a weakened immune system, if I was elderly or very, very young, I would not do that. Another place where diseases can be spread is with contaminated water. Approximately 1 in 3 people worldwide lack access to clean, safe drinking water. In the US, most places have clean, safe drinking water. This is one of the things that makes me mad, though, because there are places that do not. And they're usually places with primarily what we call the minority people. So you may recall the Flint, Michigan water crisis a few years ago. Flint, Michigan is largely African American. We also see this in places where there's extreme poverty. So drinking water out of the tap in places like rural West Virginia may not be safe. So even in the US, we're not guaranteed to have clean, safe drinking water, which I think is incredibly shameful. In 2012, the last year I was able to get good information on, there were around 840,000 deaths caused by drinking contaminated water. How does the water get contaminated? One of the ways, the number one way, is poor sanitation. Lacking infrastructure to deal with human waste. Leaking or failing infrastructure. Our sewage systems across the US are largely elderly. They largely have not been maintained well, and a lot of them are leaking and failing. You probably know this. You probably hear when there's a lot of rain or a lot of water coming in at king tide or melting snow up in Massachusetts, they'll tell you don't swim at certain beaches. I think Lynn Beach, the beach off of Lynn, is one of the major ones where they say don't swim here. And that's because the sewage system can leak and it can get into the stormwater runoff system. And then the stormwater runoff brings, honestly, fecal bacteria into the water, into the ocean. Now, you cannot tell if water is contaminated by looking at it, smelling it, or tasting it. So usually you do lab tests, and somebody does a lab test, finds bacteria or chemicals in the water, and you're good to go. There is one interesting and relatively cheap alternative. Remember when I said shellfish filter the water, and that's how they can get contaminated? They are very sensitive to certain types of water pollution. And it's a large, diverse range of things that bother them. So how do we use shellfish? There are two things we can look at. We can look at population levels. We can see if populations are declining or increasing. And we can use sentinel animals. And I've got another slide for that one. So these are sentinel clams. I just love that phrase. There are certain locations. These are widespread in Poland. They are used in Minneapolis, in the US, and several other places. And they use these claims to monitor water quality. Minneapolis has, last time I got the numbers, 12 mussels that get water from the Mississippi River flowing over them constantly. So they bring the water in to the mussels containers, and the water comes straight from the Mississippi. And they have these little sensors. You can see these wires here. These sensors detect if the mussels are open or closed. Mussels close their shell when they detect chemicals. They're not as good at detecting infectious diseases, but for chemicals, this is really, really good. And they are very sensitive to low levels of certain really dangerous chemicals, including things like oil. So they'll detect an oil spill before there's any other way you can detect that. So they can be used to detect oil spills and several other toxic chemicals. And mussels live for about 50 years. So this is a cheap and easy way to monitor specifically chemical levels in rivers, oceans, all kinds of places. So where are waterborne diseases, or what are the waterborne diseases that we really worry about? There's a disease called cholera. It is a digestive disease that causes both vomiting and diarrhea. It can dehydrate people very quickly, and it can be very, very lethal. This is a major problem mostly in poor countries, but we'll see it occasionally in westernized countries and well-off countries. We are in the midst of a cholera pandemic. So there is a cholera pandemic going on. Even though we're not hearing about it in the news, it is a problem in lots of places. On cruise ships, norovirus and rotavirus, again, these are digestive diseases that spread like crazy. Other things we worry about in contaminated water: lead from lead pipes. We saw that in Flint, Michigan. It became a real problem. We would call that an epidemic, even though it's not a contagious disease. And the other thing, pesticides and herbicides. In the United States, we have an obsession with lawns. And generally speaking, these are just grass, nothing else growing there. And in order to maintain these perfect monocultures, you have to use a lot of pesticides and herbicides. Pesticides are designed to kill insects, herbicides are designed to kill plants, but there has never been a pesticide or an herbicide that has been found that is not going to cause some effect in humans. Oh, you'll hear that they're safe. They'll tell you they're safe. Once you get a certain amount in your bloodstream, it's going to be a problem, no matter what that pesticide or herbicide is. All right, and the last way I want to talk about disease spread is sex and contact. Sexually transmitted infections can be spread between people. This does not require penetration. Most of these will spread easier when there's penetration, but it doesn't have to be penetration. Consistent use of condoms can significantly reduce the spread. Consistent use. But as we'll see, these STIs can be spread both with penetration, but also with oral sex or anal sex, or even just hand contact between the genitals. We also have a vaccine for HPV, which is very, very effective at preventing the spread of these human papillomaviruses, HPVs, that can cause cancer. So there are a wide range of strains of HPV, and some of them contribute to cancer, others do not. These cancers, we tend to think of them as this as a cause of cervical cancers. Almost all cervical cancers are caused by HPV infection. But you can also get vaginal, penile, anal, oral, and throat cancers from HPV infection. What we've seen is since the vaccine came out, the population, if we look at the population that was the right age to get the vaccine when it was first coming out, and we compare people in that group who got vaccinated to people who didn't, specifically looking at cervical cancer, the cervical cancer rates of those who got the HPV vaccine are significantly and drastically lower than the same age group if they didn't get the HPV vaccine. So I'm a big fan of the HPV vaccine. It is saving lives. When we talk about contact, we can talk about hands, hugs, and kisses. So all of these can transmit diseases. With hands, one of the common things is touching a contaminated surface. So surfaces can be contaminated by some diseases, but not all. And if you touch something that has that disease, and then you pick your nose, rub your eye, touch your mouth, touch your genitals, you can catch the disease that way. And this is very common with things like the common cold, chicken pox, conjunctivitis, or pink eye. And some of the fecal oral diseases can also be spread through touching contaminated surfaces. Not all of them. So doorknobs, toys, shaking hands can all spread a lot of these fecal oral diseases. One last thing about STIs, sexually transmitted infections. If you think you have an STI, see your doctor. Don't be embarrassed. Go and tell them that you're having this problem. Because while a lot of STIs, you know, it's like head colds. Some of them are good, some of them are good. Some of them have mild disease. Some people get severe disease and pneumonia, and you know, that's really bad. Some STIs are minor infections that might cause itching, irritation, but others can contribute to infertility. They can literally permanently make you infertile. And some of them, like syphilis, can cause brain damage, and some of them can be fatal. So you want to treat them. Gonorrhea and syphilis can be treated. The earlier you catch them, the better, the less likely you are to have permanent injuries. Okay, so what we've covered here, ways of disease transmission. We've talked about airborne transmission. We've talked about vector, which can be either mechanical or bite associated. We've talked about fecal oral, which can be contaminated food or water or contact. Or, yeah, we talked about that. And we also talked about sex and sex transmitted diseases. Any questions on this part? Oh, you guys are really quiet today.
I actually do have a question, but it's like more of a silly question, kind of.
That's okay.
All right. So I heard that when you flush your toilet, that fecal matter can be spread into the air, but I definitely don't think that's true.
It can, but not very far, and most of it will be contained within the toilet. You do
Okay.
get water droplets that come out of the toilet. But you're not getting fecal bacteria on your toothbrush.
Yeah.
Is one of the rumors. That doesn't happen. No.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is, where do diseases come from? COVID is a new disease. Where did it come from? HIV, we started hearing about it in the 1980s. Where did that one come from? This is a complex little image here. And it's talking about emerging infectious diseases. That's what we call new ones. They can come from existing diseases in humans that have evolved and changed. They can come from diseases in domestic animals, and they can come from diseases in wildlife. So basically, diseases come from pre-existing diseases. And some of the stuff on this little wheel, we're not really going to talk about. A lot of it we're going to talk about briefly. So when we talk about evolution, evolution can cause a disease to spread faster. So we saw this with the Omicron variant of COVID. It started to spread faster. We can also see evolution to make things deadlier, or to move between humans and animals. Not everything is capable of doing this. Some diseases that we catch, our pets cannot catch. Some things that occur in domestic animals or wild animals, we cannot catch. Sometimes what happens is not so much evolution, but we get an old disease that moves into a new population. And this new population can be in a different area. So people can move to a different area, taking their diseases with them. This was a huge, huge problem when the Europeans started invading the Americas. And we'll talk about this a little bit a couple of times this semester, but when the Europeans came to America, they brought diseases like measles and smallpox that nobody in the Americas had been exposed to before. The European population had some resistance to it. They had some ability to survive these diseases at a higher rate. And mostly because the people who were most vulnerable were killed off. But in the New World, they'd never seen that before. And so we saw population declines in North, Central, and South America of over 90%. Yes, you heard that correctly. When the Europeans invaded the Americas, the native populations in America declined by over 90% because they had no immunity or selection for people who were immune to these diseases. So they were highly, highly vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons, one of the big reasons the Europeans were able to conquer the New World. Sometimes immunity wanes, and a pre-existing disease that had become kind of low background levels of infection, you'll get a spike in this. And a lot of times these diseases, we call them diseases of childhood. So measles is a great example. In places where measles occurs naturally, most people get it when they're children, and then they have immunity and they don't get it again. So when enough children have been born that have not gotten measles, you start to see an outbreak in that population. So you start to see a spike in measles cases. We can also talk about diseases that come from other organisms that are new to science. When we find a new disease, that either means it's rare, it's a zoonotic that has just spilled over into humans, or it's only found in specific locations, especially in locations where there's not a lot of health infrastructure. We have discovered approximately 40 new diseases since the 1970s. So that gives you an idea. We discover a new disease that's an emerging infectious disease that Western science hasn't known about. Let's see, the 1970s. Okay, so about one a year. Maybe a little less than one a year, but approximately just under one or one a year. These diseases sometimes do not spread wildly. In fact, it's common that they don't spread wildly. Ebola, we have outbreaks, but it's generally restricted to a specific area. I'm going to clear this for a second. So Ebola, we know there is an animal reservoir. A reservoir is an animal that has a disease that it's endemic in their population. And when a human is exposed to an infected animal, they get the disease. We do not yet have confirmation of what animal is the reservoir for Ebola. We have not found any Ebola virus in any specimen that we've looked at trying to figure out where Ebola comes from. If we knew what kind of animal Ebola was the reservoir, we could, educate people not to get exposed to that animal. But we haven't found it in any animal. We do know that there is an early warning for this particular one. Specifically, local populations of chimps and gorillas disappear or are found dead. So when the chimps and gorillas start dying, that's a good sign that there's an Ebola outbreak in their population, and it's likely to show up in people. We talked a little bit about SARS and MERS. These were coronavirus outbreaks. SARS appeared in China originally, had very high mortality, but appears to have been eradicated. And we have found SARS or viruses that look like they caused SARS in some bats. MERS appeared in 2012 in Saudi Arabia. It's also been found in South Korea. It has a mortality rate of around 35%. It's a huge mortality rate. It still exists. It's mostly directly transmitted between an infected animal, often camels, and humans, and very rarely between humans. So now let's go back to our emerging infectious disease image here. Diseases can spread between wildlife and domestic animals when domestic animals encroach on wild spaces. So there has to be an exposure between the domestic animal and wildlife. And the diseases can go either way. So if you've got a dog and your dog likes to run on the beach, you want to make sure they don't interact with any seals that are up on the beach, because diseases can spread between seals and dogs. And one of the biggest threats to marine mammals is distemper. It's a disease that occurs in dogs, and it can be deadly for seals and sea lions. But domestic animals can also get diseases from wildlife. So your dog can get diseases from seals on the beach. Diseases in domestic animals can emerge, become more likely to be an infectious disease when there is what we call intensification of agriculture. So animals that are being kept in tight quarters, very close to each other, and in very large numbers. So these are a lot of poultry farms and feedlots for cattle. They're not very nice places. Humans and domestic animals can spread diseases back and forth just through regular interactions. A human disease can spread and become an epidemic or a pandemic because of things like global travel, urbanization. What we mean here with urbanization, there are two things that can be going on here. One is if we're having people move into cities, we're in crowded conditions. We're being exposed to more people. Anytime you have high concentrations of one species in a given area, there's an increased risk of an emerging infectious disease. And then between humans and wildlife, human encroachment can be an issue. This means that people are moving into areas where wildlife is found. They're more likely to be exposed to that wildlife. and either spread diseases from us to the wildlife or from the wildlife to us. We also see this a problem with what we call ecological manipulation. I'm going to expand on this and call it ecological change. This can be humans eliminating wild spaces. If there are wild spaces that are eliminated, those animals don't have somewhere to go. The animals that lived there now have the option of living in close contact with people or dying. Some animals can adapt very well to living close to people. And so we see this happening where there is wild spaces being lost. And so we see this in things like coyotes, and we see it in raccoons and possums and white-tailed deer. Even in some places, we'll see it in larger animals, not so much in the US. We still have a little bit more wild space than most places, but we see leopards living in large cities in India, which, you know, is just amazing and surprising. We also see ecological change when there is some kind of ecological crisis. So massive storms, droughts, floods, volcanic action. So massive storms, droughts, and floods, those are increasing with climate change. Volcanic action is one of the few things that humans are not capable of impacting in the world. And so that's not changing at all. So all of these sorts of things increase the risk of emerging infectious diseases. So some of these diseases that spread into people that can persist for long periods of time in people and that have high mortality rates. We've seen it with HIV. We've seen it with our plague. This is my little plague doctor. We're seeing it now with COVID. What often happens is that the disease will be severe at first and then not as severe. And this can happen because it can kill off the vulnerable. This is the case with plague. Plague definitely killed off the people who were most vulnerable to it. And the survivors have a genetic advantage of some kind that they pass on to their offspring. Or it can be evolution of the disease vector. But there's no guarantee that the disease vector will evolve to become milder. It can also evolve to become more severe. And immunity. So people who are exposed to diseases develop immunity to them. And when the population gets immune, so when you get a large number of people who are immune in a population, that reduces the spread. So it's less likely to be able to spread in that population. And we'll talk about that and how that works when we talk about the immune system. Okay. We are right on schedule today. The last thing I want to talk about today is types of infectious agents. So infectious agents are anything that can spread between people. So it has to spread, and it causes disease. It doesn't have to cause disease in everybody who's infected, but it has to cause disease in some people who are infected. And our list of infectious agents are viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites, and prions. And I'm going to talk about these one at a time. And I'm just going to give you a little overview of what these different categories are. So when we talk about viruses, a virus is not living. It is not alive. It is basically genetic material wrapped in a protein coat. So seriously, there may be some enzymes inside, but it's not doing anything. If it's not infecting an organism, if it's not infecting a cell, it's not doing anything. It's just inert. So there's no metabolism, no ability to move, no ability to reproduce outside of a host cell. So that's a cell that's been infected. They can't do any of that stuff. We call these guys obligate intracellular parasites. Obligate means they have to be, that's required. Intra refers to inside. Cellular is the cell. So they have to be inside a cell. And we say they're parasites because they cannot survive outside of a host. They can't actively do things outside of a host. They can be inert or not active, not doing anything. How long they can be outside of a host and still be infectious varies depending on the virus. So this is a drawing, it's a cross-sectional drawing of HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. There's the genetic material inside. It's got a very complicated protein coat around the outside. HIV, if you spilled HIV on your desk, by the time you grow it, you have to grow it in cells. If you spilled it on your desk, it would be in liquid. And by the time the liquid died, the virus would be dead as well. It does not survive very long at all on surfaces. Very, very short life expectancy. Look, we do use terms like living, surviving, dead when we talk about viruses. It's not really accurate, but it's a useful way of describing them. Because they're kind of somewhere in between living and dead. Our second category is bacteria. These are living, single-celled organisms. They can, under certain conditions, form clusters or colonies. But if you break up that cluster and colony, each individual cell can survive on its own. These are small. They're hard to see, even with the microscopes, the kind of microscopes that we have at North Shore, except in the microbiology lab. It's very hard or impossible to see bacteria. Most can be treated with antibiotics, but antibiotic resistance is on the rise. Viruses are so much smaller than bacteria that there's no way to see those using a light microscope. They're just too small, no matter how much magnification you use. You have to use what's called an electron microscope. Fungal infections. These are also living. They're related to things like mushrooms. Generally speaking, they're in mammals. They're found on the skin or under nails, especially toenails. The fungi that can cause disease, there's not a really wide range of these. Some of them are very common, however, and they can be on your skin without causing disease. And these are things like jock itch, yeast infection, athletes. I think I spelled that wrong. And ringworm. These are generally harder to treat than bacteria. There are some less common but more dangerous yeast infections or fungal infections, I'm sorry. There's a disease called aspergillosis, which is a common mold, but if it gets in your lungs, it can cause a type of pneumonia. There is pneumocystis pneumonia, which is commonly abbreviated PCP. This tends not to cause diseases in people with a healthy immune system, but it is a problem for immunocompromised people. So we'll talk about that more when we're talking about HIV. All fungal diseases are more common in people who are immunocompromised. Parasites. So parasites, it's a diverse category of organisms. These are animals or a type of organism called a protist, which you probably haven't heard about before. They must spend at least part of their life on another organism, on or in another organism. So some of these things that we consider parasites, they may only need a blood meal. So they may just have to take a bite of blood. And these are things like lice, scabies, various types of worms, roundworm and pinworm and tapeworm and hookworm. This also includes toxoplasmosis, which is what you're seeing here. So this is an image of a retina, the back of somebody's eye. So you can see blood vessels in here. This is the blind spot right here. This is toxoplasmosis. It is very, very common. Most people will never have symptoms. It is dangerous, again, to immunocompromised people, and it is dangerous to the developing fetus or embryo in pregnant women. You can get this through contact or eating undercooked meat. or shellfish. And most commonly in modern humans, contact with cat feces. This is why pregnant women are not allowed to clean litter boxes. Because if your cat has ever gone outside, it probably has toxoplasmosis. If your cat has toxoplasmosis, it's going to lay, eggs are going to be in the feces. And if you accidentally handle the feces and then touch a mucous membrane, you can be infected. Infection with toxoplasmosis, there's a lot of debate about symptoms in people. As I said, most people don't get symptoms, but if you've got a fetus or an embryo that gets infected, the parasite can form a cyst anywhere in the body. This is a cyst right here. And if the cyst forms in the brain, that can cause brain damage. If the cyst forms in an organ, it can cause organ damage. If the pregnancy is in the very, very early stages and the cyst gets into the very, very early embryo, it can cause birth defects. The deadliest parasite, however, is malaria. This disease has been eliminated through much of its former range. So a lot of places that used to have it don't have it anymore. It is still causing over 600,000 deaths per year, mostly in children. And as I've mentioned, it may very well be the deadliest infectious disease in the history of humans. Okay, our last category is a weird one, and it's prions. So prions are not spread from person to person, with an asterisk here. Except in societies that practice cannibalism. So we tend to think of cannibalism, we tend to get freaked out about it in the Western world. A lot of societies practice ritual cannibalism of relatives who have died naturally as a way to absorb some of the characteristics of that person or their spirit or that sort of stuff. So we don't want to say that cannibalism is always a horrible thing, even though it makes us all go, ooh. It can be transmitted through it can show up through genetic mutation or from food. Specifically, it can be spread from cows or sheep that are infected. So a prion is just a misfolded protein. All proteins have a specific shape that they have to have that's critical for their ability to function. And prions are a normal protein found in the brain that's the wrong shape. And it's the wrong shape either because of a genetic mutation, but the weird thing is, if you eat this misfolded protein, somehow it survives the digestive process, gets into the brain, and it can trigger misfolding of the protein that already exists in your brain. The protein that's a normal shape, if it's exposed to the misfolded protein, will shape the wrong way. It'll change its shape. And what this causes is a fatal neurodegenerative disease. And these are generally called spongiform encephalopathies. Ooh, Just give me one more minute and we can wrap this up. Spongiform means it looks spongy. This is a microscope image of an infected brain, and you can see the holes in it, lots and lots of small holes. This is a normal brain tissue right here. So the brain looks like a sponge. Encephal refers to the brain. Pathy refers to a disorder or a disease. And here's a normal brain, cross section. Here's an infected brain. You can see that a lot of the tissue has been lost. The folds are bigger, the cavities are bigger. There's just less brain matter. It's causing a lot of cells to die. Okay. That is that. Our next topic is going to be HIV. Do you guys have any questions on what we covered today? Nope, I guess you guys are heading out. All right, I'll see you guys next time then.
Thank you very much.
You're
See you
welcome.
next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.